I think it's important for us to rebel all the time.
Some tragedies are difficult to understand because they happen in places built on routine, trust, and care. A school gym, a workday, a young coach with her life ahead of her. Nothing in mass setting suggests the kind of ending the story would come to represent. And yet, in October 2023, a case out of Sydney, Australia, left a school community grieving, a family devastated, and investigators piecing together a timeline that seemed to point toward a deeply personal act. This is the story of Lily James, a 20-year-old water polo coach at St. Andrew's Cathedral School, whose death shocked those around her. It is also the story of her brief workplace relationship that, according to investigators, did not end as quietly as it began. What followed was not just a criminal investigation, but a difficult attempt to understand how resentments, rejection, and private turmoil could collide in such a catastrophic way. At the center of this story is a young woman remembered not for controversy, but for warmth. Lily James was 20 years old and worked as a water polo coach at St. Andrew's Cathedral School in Sydney. In the aftermath of her death, the people who knew her described her as talented and kind. Those words matter, because cases like this can quickly become dominated by timelines, footage, and speculation. But before any investigation took shape, before police examined movements and motives, there was simply the reality that a young life had ended, and that an entire community was left trying to process what had happened. The setting only made the shock more intense. A school was meant to feel structured and familiar. Even a gymnasium, with its changing rhythms of training, coaching, and students moving through the day, carries a sense of order. It is a place where people expect activity, discipline, and ordinary routine. That is part of what makes the events of October 25, 2023 so unsettling. On that day, Lily was found deceased in the school's gymnasium shower area with severe head injuries. The summary of the case gives that fact in the plain language of an investigation. But behind those few words is something much larger, the moment a normal environment becomes the site of irreversible loss. From there, the case moved quickly into the realm of evidence. Security footage became central to the investigation. According to that footage, 24-year-old Paul Tyson, a former co-worker and brief romantic partner of Lily's, was identified as the person who followed her into the area. He even stated as carefully as possible that detail changes the shape of the story. This was not a mystery built around a stranger entering an unknown space. Investigators were looking at someone who had known Lily, someone who had worked around her, and someone with whom she had briefly been involved. That fact introduces one of the most unsettling elements in the case: proximity. The people who leave the deepest mark on our lives are often the people we know in ordinary settings. Co-workers, acquaintances, short-lived romantic partners. These are not the figures most people imagine when they think about life-altering danger. And yet the summary of this case suggests that the emotional stakes of that brief relationship did not end when the relationship itself ended. Investigators believe Tyson acted out of resentment after Lily ended things. That interpretation gives the story a tragic emotional core. What may have seemed from the outside like a private and limited workplace romance was, in the view of investigators, carrying consequences that Lily may never have imagined would become so severe. 2 days after Lily was found, the case took another dramatic turn. On October 27, 2023, Paul Tyson was found dead at Diamond Bay Reserve following a fall. Investigators concluded that he had committed the crime and then taken his own life. In one sense, that conclusion closed the practical question of who was responsible, but in another sense, it left behind a different kind of unanswered space. The kind that often lingers after cases like this, when investigators identify a probable sequence of events, but the person they believe carried them out is no longer alive. To speak, the public is left with a timeline with evidence, and with the painful limits of what can never be fully known. That is why motive becomes so important here. Not because motive can make sense of what happened in a comforting way. It cannot. But because it is often the only framework investigators have for explaining how a private emotional conflict becomes a public tragedy. In this case, the summary points to several pieces of evidence that shape that interpretation. It states that Tyson purchased a hammer shortly before the attack. It also states that evidence suggested he acted out of resentment after Lily ended the relationship. Together, those elements led investigators toward the view that this was not impulsive in the simplest sense, but deliberate. That conclusion was later echoed in expert commentary included in the summary. Forensic psychologist Tim Watson Monroe described Tyson as having narcissistic traits and psychopathic tendencies. He concluded that the act was deliberate, planned, and driven by an inability to accept rejection. Those are serious characterizations, and they sit within the case's expert analysis rather than casual opinion. They do not erase complexity, and they do not pretend to explain every inner thought, but they do offer one possible lens through which investigators and observers tried to understand the emotional force behind the case. Not a misunderstanding, not a random collapse of judgment, but an extreme response to rejection. Even so, the story does not belong solely to the investigation. It also belongs to the people who were left behind. In the public memory of cases like this, there is always a risk that the person of the center becomes reduced to the event itself. But the response from Lily's family, friends, and school community resists that reduction. They mourned her as a vibrant person, someone whose presence carried energy and promise. At a memorial held in her honor, attendees were asked to wear bright colors. It is such a simple image, and perhaps that is why it stays with people. Bright colors at a memorial suggest a refusal to let grief define someone entirely. They acknowledge sorrow, but they also insist on remembering light. That contrast may be the most haunting part of this case. On one side is a brutal rupture. A young coach found dead in a place tied to daily life and responsibility. On the other is the memory of someone described as kind, talented, and vibrant enough that the people who loved her chose color, not darkness, to honor her. Between those two realities sits the investigation, the footage, the timeline, the relationship, the suspected resentment, and the conclusion reached by police. It is a case that forces together two truths that are often hard to hold at the same time: that ordinary lives can be interrupted without warning, and that the people lost in those moments deserve to be remembered for far more than the circumstances of their death. What makes some cases so difficult to absorb is not only what happened, but how quickly an ordinary day can harden into a sequence of facts. At first, there is confusion. Then there is a location, a time, a set of images, a name. Investigations often begin in fragments. In this case, those fragments pointed toward a deeply personal connection. On October 25, 2023, Lily Janes was found in the gymnasium shower area at St. Two, Andrews Cathedral School in Sydney, with severe head injuries. That is the fixed point from which everything else in the case is measured. It is the moment the story moves from private life into public record. For the people who knew her, it would have been a devastating shock. For investigators, it became the beginning of a timeline they would work to reconstruct with care. One of the most important pieces of that reconstruction came from security footage. According to the summary of the case, the footage identified 24-year-old Paul Tyson as the person who followed Lily into the area. That detail is stark, and it matters for more than one reason. Surveillance footage does not explain emotion. It does not tell us what someone was thinking. It does not offer motive in any complete sense, but it can do something just as important. In a case like this, it can establish movement, proximity, and sequence. It can show who was where and when. That kind of evidence tends to shift the entire tone of an investigation. What may begin as a search for possibilities becomes a narrower effort to understand intention. Once Tyson was linked to Lily through the footage, investigators were no longer dealing only with a tragedy at a school. They were dealing with the aftermath of an encounter between two people who had known each other. That connection is one of the defining features of this story. Tyson was not described as a stranger. He was a former co-worker and a brief romantic partner. Those two facts, placed side by side, create a troubling kind of intimacy. The relationship was not described as long-term. It was not framed in the summary as a dramatic public conflict. On the surface, it appears to have been something limited, something that may have seemed, from the outside, manageable and private. But the distance between what a relationship looks like publicly and what it means privately can be enormous. Investigators would later conclude that the end of that relationship mattered far more than it may have appeared to anyone around them. This is often where documentary storytelling must slow down There is a temptation in true crime to race from clue to clue, to treat each development as a twist. But cases involving real people deserve a steadier rhythm. The most unsettling truth here is not that the investigation found a dramatic thread. It is that the thread was so painfully familiar. A brief relationship, a breakup, lingering resentment, and then consequences no one should ever have to imagine. The summary states that investigators believe Tyson acted out of resentment after Lily ended the relationship. That conclusion gives shape to the case, but it also reveals something more difficult. In some tragedies, the danger is not loud. It is not always announced. Sometimes it lives quietly in another person's refusal to accept that something is over. The evidence investigators relied on appears, at least in the summary, to support a view of planning rather than sudden chaos. One detail stands out with particular force. Tyson is said to have purchased a hammer shortly before the attack. That information changes the emotional temperature of the case. It suggests preparation. It suggests a decision made before the final encounter took place. And when an investigation reaches that kind of conclusion, the event no longer looks like a moment that simply spiraled. It begins to look deliberate. That distinction matters because it shapes how the public understands responsibility. In many cases, people search for signs of confusion, instability, or impulsive collapse, hoping those ideas might make the event seem less intentional. But the picture presented in this summary is not one of simple loss of control. It is one in which investigators saw evidence of resentment connected to rejection, and evidence that a weapon had been purchased beforehand. Neither point answers every question, but together they point in one direction. Then, 2 days later, the case shifted again. On October 27, 2023, Paul Tyson was found dead at Diamond Bay Reserve following a fall. That discovery did not erase the shock of Lily's death. It deepened the complexity of the case. It meant the person investigators believed was responsible was no longer available to question, confront, or prosecute. It meant the story would not move toward a courtroom where evidence is tested in public and motive is argued in detail. Instead, the conclusion would rest on the investigation itself and the evidence it gathered. Investigators ultimately concluded that Tyson committed the crime and then took his own life. In practical terms, that finding brought the case to a close. But emotionally, cases like this do not close so easily. They leave behind a silence that no legal outcome can fully answer. There's no testimony from the person accused, no final explanation offered in his own words. What remains is the record, the footage, the relationship, the timing, the purchase investigators considered significant, and the final discovery at Diamond Bay Reserve. That is part of what gives this case its lingering power. It is not a story built on endless uncertainty. The summary points to a clear investigative conclusion, and yet clarity is not the same thing as comfort. Knowing what investigators believed happened does not soften the loss. It does not make the school setting feel less haunting, or the circumstances less painful. If anything, the apparent deliberateness of the act makes the human cost feel even heavier. In stories like this, the details do not only establish guilt, they also reveal how private grievance can move into public consequence. A brief affair in a workplace can appear, from the outside, almost too small to matter beyond the people involved. That is part of the warning carried by this case. Harm does not always arrive wrapped in spectacle. Sometimes it takes shape in ordinary places, around ordinary relationships, under the surface of normal routine. And when that surface breaks, the aftermath is measured not only by what investigators can prove, but by what a community must carry. Some cases are remembered for the complexity of the evidence. Others are remembered for the setting, or the speed with which events unfolded. This one lingers for a different reason. It forces attention onto a question that is deeply uncomfortable and never easy to answer. What happens when one person experiences the end of a relationship, not as a boundary to accept, but as something to resist at any cost? By the time investigators had assembled the core timeline, the outline of the case had become stark. Lily James, a 20-year-old water polo coach at St. Andrew's Cathedral School in Sydney, was found on October 25, 2023, in the school's gymnasium shower area with severe head injuries. Security footage identified 24-year-old Paul Tyson, a former co-worker and brief romantic partner, as the person who followed her into that area. 2 days later, Tyson was found dead at Diamond Bay Reserve following a fall. Investigators concluded that he had committed the crime and then taken his own life. Those are the established points in the summary. But facts alone do not explain the emotional architecture of a case like this. They tell us what investigators believed happened. They do not automatically tell us how to understand it. That is where interpretation enters, carefully and with limits. According to the summary, evidence suggested Tyson purchased a hammer shortly before the attack. Investigators also believed he acted out of resentment after Lily ended their relationship. Taken together, those details led away from any explanation rooted in sudden confusion or fleeting dispute. They suggested intent, not just anger in the abstract, but anger attached to rejection and shaped by an inability to accept that another person had chosen to step away. That conclusion was reinforced by forensic psychologist Tim Watson Monroe, whose assessment appears in the summary. He described Tyson as having narcissistic traits and psychopathic tendencies. More importantly, he concluded that the act was deliberate, planned, and driven by an inability to accept rejection. Those words are measured, but they are also severe. They frame the event not as an emotional accident, but as a purposeful act connected to wounded control. There is a difficult distinction here, and it matters. Rejection is a universal human experience. Almost everyone, at some point, has to absorb disappointment, loss, or the end of a relationship they did not want to lose. Most people do so painfully, but within the boundaries of ordinary life. What makes this case so unsettling is not rejection itself. It is the suggestion that rejection became, in Tyson's mind, something intolerable. That is why the expert language in this case carries such weight. Terms like narcissistic traits and psychopathic tendencies are not casual labels. In this context, they point toward a personality structure in which another person's autonomy may be experienced as a threat rather than a fact. If that interpretation is correct, then the end of the relationship was not merely disappointing to him. It may have felt like humiliation, loss of control, or an unacceptable challenge to how he saw himself. Again, that does not excuse anything. It does the opposite. It sharpens the sense that the danger lay in a refusal to accept another person's right to say no, to leave, or to redefine the relationship. That refusal is central to the tragedy. Lily's decision to end the relationship should have remained exactly what it was. Her decision, private, final, and hers to make. But the summary suggests that, in the view of investigators and the forensic expert, Tyson did not accept that limit. The case becomes, in that sense, about more than one individual act. It becomes a painful example of what can happen when resentment hardens into entitlement, and entitlement hardens into action. Still, it is important not to let analysis overwhelm the person at the center of the story. Documentary language can sometimes become so focused on motive that it begins to orbit the accused rather than the victim. In this case, the response of Lily's community offers a necessary correction. She was mourned by family, friends, and the school community as a talented and kind individual. Those descriptions are simple, but their simplicity is powerful. They pull the story back toward who she was in life, rather than leaving her defined only by the violence investigators believed ended it. The memorial held in her honor deepens that impression. Attendees were asked to wear bright colors to reflect her vibrant spirit. It is a striking image, precisely because it resists the emotional gravity of the case without denying it. Bright colors at a memorial do not erase grief. They do something more delicate. They insist that remembrance can hold sorrow and vitality at the same time. They suggest that the people who love Lily wanted the public memory of her to include joy, energy, and presence, not only loss. That choice changes the emotional tone of the story. It reminds us that behind every case summary is a life lived in ordinary moments that never appear in official timelines. Conversations, workdays, small kindnesses, routines, hopes. The summary tells us Lily was talented and kind. It tells us her spirit was vibrant enough that color itself became part of how people chose to honor her. That may be one of the clearest and most human details in the entire account. In the end, the case leaves two very different impressions side by side. One is the cold logic of investigation, footage, dates, a suspected motive, an expert assessment, and an official conclusion. The other is human memory, which does not move like an investigation at all. Memory is less interested in sequence than in presence. It asks who someone was, how they were loved, and what remains after the formal facts are settled. And so the story is remembered not only because investigators believed it was planned, or because an expert saw in it the inability to accept rejection. It is remembered because a young woman's life ended in circumstances that shocked a community, and because the people left behind chose to answer that darkness, at least in part, with color. In the end, some stories resist neat conclusions, not because the timeline is unclear or because the evidence points in too many directions, but because the facts themselves carry a kind of emotional contradiction. This case, as investigators understood it, appears both shockingly direct and deeply difficult to absorb. A young coach went to work. A former co-worker and brief romantic partner followed her into a private area. 2 days later, that man was also dead. Between those events sits a chain of evidence that investigators believed told a deliberate story. Around them sits something much harder to measure: grief, disbelief, and the knowledge that a place associated with learning and routine had suddenly become the setting for loss. By the time authorities reached their conclusion, the broad outline of the case had taken shape. Lily James, 20 years old, was found on October 25, 2023, in the gymnasium shower area at St. Museum Shower Area at St. Mare, Andrews Cathedral School in Sydney with severe head injuries. Security footage identified 24-year-old Paul Tyson as the person who followed her into that area. Tyson, a former co-worker and brief romantic partner, was later found dead on October 27, 2023 at Diamond Bay Reserve following a fall. Investigators concluded that he had committed the crime and then taken his own life. That conclusion gives the case a formal ending, but not a simple one. The official sequence answers the central investigative question of who police believed was responsible. It also leaves behind the kind of silence that no conclusion can really fill. There is no courtroom testimony, no extended public unpacking by the person investigators identified, no final explanation that can make the emotional logic of the act feel comprehensible in any ordinary sense. What remains is the evidence, the interpretation built around it, and the people who have to live with what happened. Among the details that shape the investigation, one stands out with particular force: the suggestion that Tyson purchased a hammer shortly before the attack. In a case already marked by personal connection, that detail seems to have carried enormous significance. It suggested more than anger in a passing moment. It suggested preparation. When paired with the view that he acted out of resentment after Lily ended their relationship, it led investigators toward a conclusion that this was not random and not simply the result of a sudden argument. It was, in their view, deliberate. That same interpretation was reinforced by forensic psychologist Tim Watson-Monroe, whose analysis appears in the summary. He described Tyson as having narcissistic traits and psychopathic tendencies, and concluded that the act was planned and driven by an inability to accept rejection. Those are heavy words, but they help explain why this case continued to resonate so strongly. It was not understood as a misunderstanding or a breakdown of communication. It was understood as something more disturbing, a deeply personal refusal to accept another person's decision. That may be the most painful lesson at the center of this story. Brief relationships can leave uneven emotional footprints. One person may see the end as difficult but ordinary. Another may experience it with resentment that grows in private, out of view, until it no longer resembles ordinary disappointment at all. The summary does not pretend to explain every thought or every emotional step. It does, however, present a clear investigative theory. Lily ended the relationship. Tyson, investigators believed, could not accept that ending. From that inability came a series of actions with irreversible consequences. And yet, for all the attention paid to motive, planning, and evidence, the story never truly belongs to the mechanics of the case alone. It belongs just as much to the life that was lost and to the people who were left behind. Lily is remembered in the summary not through a long public record or catalog of achievements, but through the words that often matter most when someone is gone: talented, kind, vibrant. Those are not legal terms. They do not appear in forensic reports. They come from the people who knew her as a person rather than a headline. That distinction matters. Cases like this can become consumed by the actions of the person accused. especially when the circumstances are shocking. Public attention narrows. The victim's identity risks being flattened into a single terrible event. The response from Lily's family, friends, and school community pushed against that flattening. They mourned her, not only with sadness, but with a clear effort to preserve the brightness of who she had been. At a memorial held in her honor, attendees were asked to wear bright colors to reflect her spirit. It is a striking image to leave with, not because it softens what happened, but because it places memory where it belongs. Bright colors at a memorial do not deny tragedy. They insist that grief should not become the only language available to describe a person. In that small but powerful decision, the people closest to Lily seemed to say something essential, that she should be remembered not only through the violence investigators believed ended her life, but through the warmth and energy that defined it. So the case remains in two forms at once. It remains, first, as an investigation, a date, a location, a sequence of movements on security footage, a purchase investigators considered important, an expert opinion about motive, and a final police conclusion. But it also remains as something more human than any case file can fully hold. A young woman working at a school, a community suddenly in mourning, a memorial marked by color instead of shadow. The sense familiar in tragedies like this that ordinary places can carry hidden tensions no one else can see until it is too late. Perhaps that is why this story stays with people, not because it offers mystery without answers, but because it offers answers that are hard to sit with. A brief workplace affair may have seemed harmless on the surface. Investigators came to believe it ended in planning, resentment, and devastating finality. And in the space left behind, the clearest thing that remains is Lily herself, remembered by those who loved her as someone bright enough that even in mourning, they choose color.